You know, the complete works of Shakespeare abridged are hysterical if you know the plays, but still very funny even if you don't.
Mhm.
Even if you've only got a vague idea of the outlines of some of it.
I don't know all of Shakespeare's, but did have to suffer through the mandatory ones in high school that I did not enjoy.
And they do, clips and things of different plays, and then they do jokes on some of the other plays. Then they do, at the end, they do a short, funny version of Hamlet, then they do Hamlet in reverse, then they do Hamlet at high speed in reverse. Just, I don't know, it's just fun.
So I don't know why. So my ninth grade English class, Miss Goodson, she's a great teacher. But why do you have to do the stuff in the Old English? We don't know Old English. We don't understand it. If you're going to make us read it in Old English, teach us Old English first, and then have us read it. Because we're all reading through this stuff in class, and then she, the teacher, starts cracking up hysterically, and we're all looking at each other like, why is she laughing? She's like, that was a joke. Didn't you get it? We're like, no, we don't get any of this.
No, when I taught British literature when we were homeschooling, it was an exposure class, the kids had some writing and stuff, but very little, because we went through 14 books. I'm sorry, 18 books in 36 weeks, every 2 weeks, they read another, book or play or whatever. Anyway, what I acquired for them so that we could do Beowulf and Shakespeare, what I had them acquire, they have.
Modern prose.
What?
Modern prose. Yes.
Well, you have, what you have, and it helps with the teaching especially, but with them understanding, it's, Seamus Haney did an interpretation. It's got, on one page, the original,
Mhm.
and on the other page, and they have that for Shakespeare too.
Right.
So, in Shakespeare, it's not as desperately needed. For Beowulf and Chaucer, it's desperately needed.
Yeah, we did.
But the books are, side by side, so that you can, as you teach, you can talk about the comparison of language, and the
Mhm.
kids can see that it looks like this one way, and oh my gosh, this is where we get that word, and I mean, with the development,
Mhm.
etymology, I mean, it's just a nice way to do it.
Yeah.
But,
All right, we're online. We'll talk Shakespeare all day. Throne of Blood. Good morning.
hi.
Throne of Blood.
I thought you said throwing up blood, I'm
No.
like, who?
Throne of Blood is Akira Kurosawa's take on Macbeth
Okay.
as a samurai movie.
Oh, really?
It is brilliant. It is so good.
Wow, because, Macbeth and Hamlet are, but they end both of them just a bloodbath.
Oh yeah.
So
Oh,
that's a great
the
one.
final scene in Throne of Blood is so good.
I'm not,
It's
I
so
mean,
good.
that's why I can see the name.
It's black and white, but it's visually it's a masterpiece. It's just a brilliant movie.
Really?
Anyway, yeah, very good. Anyhow, okay, we're online and everybody's here, I think. Is Phil coming? Phil's not coming. Oh, okay, good.
Are you going to watch this? Yes.
All right. We're online, so let's open up in prayer. Lord, thank you for your people. Thank you for your word. And thank you for this book and the tough questions that it asks. And we just pray that you would show us your heart in all of this and be with us. In Jesus' name, amen. We are continuing, and it's been like 3 weeks, I guess. In the book of Ecclesiastes, we're in chapters 3 and 4. And, sadly, chapter 3 would be my favorite chapter in the book if it hadn't been totally ruined by a bunch of hippies. The Birds song.
Of course, we all
Right,
sang it.
okay.
I just had it
It's
on my guitar.
which was actually written by Pete Seeger. But the whole song is
Written by
taken.
Solomon.
The song was taken literally from the King James version of the first part of this chapter, and then he added a little line at the end after "a time for peace." He added, "I swear it's not too late." So that was his contribution to the whole song. Anyway, that added 6 little words at the end. But he turned this profound passage into an anti-war hippie screed, and yes, I am a little bitter. But anyway,
But there's There's a time for everything.
Yes. The context of the chapter, to remind you, is coming out of chapter 2, Solomon was exploring the inevitability of death and all that. And so as we continue here, Solomon, I think, is kind of saying what Red said in the Shawshank Redemption, get busy living. Anybody know the rest of it? Or get busy dying. I knew you wouldn't let me down there, Lewis. Okay, good. All right, chapter 3. It says, there is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing, a time to search and a time to give up as lost, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? So, the opening verse, so the word time is repeated so many times through these first 8 verses, but in verse 1, the first time he uses it, first 2 times, is a different Hebrew word than the rest of the passage. So the first verse, he uses the word zaman, which can mean time or season, like it's translated here. It's literally, it has the connotation of appointed time, a time set aside for a specific purpose. And that's exactly how it's translated in New American Standard, is appointed time. And so there's almost kind of a fatality here to this opening verse when you consider that. He's saying for every event under heaven, it's set aside as appropriate for that event. Now, the rest of the word time through the passage is just the basic Hebrew word eth, which just means time like we mean it in English. So nothing to translate there. But if you walk through these, they all represent beginnings and endings. Or sometimes they're reversed, endings and beginnings, but it's the same idea. It's 2 ends of a stick, right? And it kind of reminds me of when Jesus said, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And remember in Revelation, he said that. But like I said, sometimes it's endings and beginnings, but either way, it's the opposite ends of events that can occur, is what he's describing here. And so he opens it up in verse 2 with a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot what is planted. So for both animals and plants, it's the same thing, but one's for animals and one's for plants. There's a time to give birth and a time to die. There's a time to plant, in other words, give birth for a plant, and a time to uproot, that is to harvest or whatever. There's times where both of those are appropriate. And then he moves on to what we might say is a distasteful. I'm going to have profound things to say about a couple of these, but not about all of them. We'd be here all day, and I don't really have profound things to say about all of them without, really stretching it. He moves on to what we would think is kind of distasteful in verse 3, a time to kill and a time to heal. The word for kill here is actually the word to slay, and it is a very specific word in Hebrew. It is the word that is used of a sacrifice, when you slay a sacrifice. It has the connotation of slitting a throat, okay, because that's how you take a sacrifice, is you slit its throat. By the way, little piece as an aside, a freebie. This is the Hebrew word that was used to describe how Cain killed Abel.
Really?
And so it's interesting, he sliced his throat like a priest offering a sacrifice. And if you figure that out in the context of Cain and Abel, why was Cain upset? Because his sacrifice wasn't accepted. And Cain was basically saying in this act, you want a sacrifice? I'll give you a sacrifice. It's kind of even more brutal when you think about it that way. And also, it ties it in more closely with Hebrews, which we just studied, where he said, the blood of Christ speaks better than the blood of Abel. Right? It's a true sacrifice. Anyway, but the other side of that is to heal. So the contrast between slaying of a sacrifice and healing is kind of interesting. He continues in verse 3 with a time to tear down and a time to build up. Again, it's endings and beginnings. And this is really describing the transient nature of all things. Remember, we're talking under heaven here. This is life on the earth without God. That's the context, to borrow the phrase. I like the word entropy. It's, when something breaks in the car and Lauren asks me why it broke, I don't know why she asked me that. I always say the same thing, entropy. Right, but now we have a Toyota, so stuff breaks. And verse 4, he says, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. By the way, the word mourn there is the connotation is mourning for sin. So, yeah, there's that, in contrast with dancing and celebrating. So you mourn sin, you don't celebrate it, I guess, maybe. Verse 5, this is an interesting one that's not obvious. He says, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. Remember, this is the Middle East. What do they use for fighting? They use stones. Remember David? How do they actually execute people in one form of execution? They stone them, right? So that's probably what is being alluded to here. There's a time to fight, and there's a time to gather stones. That's prepare for fighting, or a time to kill and a time to get ready to kill.
I wonder if gathering stones, it doesn't refer to an altar then.
No. Oh, it's possible. Maybe. Okay, he continues in verse 5, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. It could be that this is just another way of saying hello and goodbye, but it could be embracing as welcoming somebody in fellowship, or to shun embracing is to shun somebody. You're put out of fellowship. It's that kind of idea. And there's a time for each. Verse 6, a time to search and a time to give up as lost, a time to keep and a time to throw away. Searching for stuff is a lot easier if you're not a hoarder. Just saying. Which is what the second half of that's talking about. Well, how do you tell if you're a hoarder? Well, if straightening up for you is arranging your stuff into neater piles, then you might be a hoarder. Then you know who you are. Verse 7, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together, a time to be silent and a time to speak. The tear apart is describing, this is interesting, it's describing the tearing of clothes, like weeping for a mourning. I remember when Lauren's mom died, at the funeral, this was my first Jewish funeral. Very enlightening if you've never been to one. We get to the funeral home, and they have a basket at the entrance of the funeral home. It's a Jewish funeral home. The basket has a little swatch of black cloth that's torn with a safety pin through it. Family members are supposed to take one and pin it on, because the Jewish custom is you tear your clothes to show your mourning. But it's modern Judaism, and you don't want to tear a good suit, so you take the thing and you pin it on. You show everybody that you're. I know it's this. It was the dumbest thing I've ever seen, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Is this for real? But it was for real, and it's what they do.
It's no more different than those memorial ribbons or pins or whatever.
Oh yeah, I know. Yeah.
Along those lines.
Yeah, it shows how much you care. Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you're really snarky today.
I am. See what happens when my wife isn't here to temper me?
All right, I'm here for you.
She completes me.
That is true. That is true.
Anyway, yes.
We better put a call in. Phone a friend.
We're praying for you. Please come back. Okay, but verse 7, where he says, be silent, time to be silent, time to speak. I've been reading in my daily readings through Job. And there's so much stuff in Job that fits with Ecclesiastes. It's all illustrations of what we're reading here. But I was reminded at the end of Job, remember his friends showed up and then they didn't speak for 7 days. And then after that, they wouldn't shut up. But at the end of Job, remember, it's all statements and responses. It goes back and forth. And this guy says that, and Job responds. And this guy says that, and Job responds. And it just goes back and forth. And at the end, God finally speaks. And when it comes time for Job to respond, do you remember what Job said? He said, I placed my hand over my mouth.
Hmm.
What can you say after God has spoken? You have all these other idiots. He had a lot the same response. But when God speaks, I got nothing, is basically. And that kind of reminds me of this. There's a time to speak, and there's a time to be silent. Now, much like the time to kill phrase earlier, this one in verse 8 also gets a bad rap. He says, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Are we supposed to hate? I thought we were supposed to even love our enemies. What's up with this, right? Well, this is talking about righteous indignation. But also, remember, this is all under the sun, without God, right? And so this is that logic. But also think of Jesus clearing the temple, right? He was kind of angry. If you read, and I bring this up a lot, but I will bring it up again, and I will keep bringing it up because it's important. If you read about the second coming of Jesus in Revelation, you find that he is described as walking through the world like a reaper with a sling blade covered in the blood of his enemies. He's treading out the winepress of the fierceness and the wrath of God. He's covered in blood, and this one time that Jesus appears covered in blood, it's not his own. That's the point. I keep saying, the people talk about Jesus returning. He's not going to be the lovey, blessy, healy Jesus. He's going to be the killy, stabby, judgy Jesus.
Even in the Old Testament, there was God paving the way for his people, Israel,
Yeah.
and the enemies of Israel were essentially the enemies of God. And while I do believe that every life that is not saved is a grief to God, on the other hand, he does.
Yeah, he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, right? Clearly, but it's important that he does that because he is justice, right? And so,
Yes.
and likewise, there's a time for war and a time for peace. Some people don't dig the whole time for war thing. You remember back when the people on the left would all sit around and just visualize world peace and the harmonic convergence of our collective goodwills will overcome the hate of the Republicans. Remember that? Yeah, exactly. That was back when the left was anti-war. Now they're just so pro-war they can't. I don't know. What happened? It's like the world got all backwards. But if you think about every significant time of peace in history, of world peace, they occur after war. And usually you don't get to peace through negotiation. You get to lasting peace. You get to lasting peace through victory, right? Now, the complement of that is not always true. War doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes war brings more war. I give you World War I. Brought us World War II. However, World War II did bring us peace. And like I said, now I drive a Toyota, and my other car's a Volkswagen. So there you go. We kind of made up, and now we buy their cars. Yeah, but peace usually comes on the after war. But he continues with the follow-on question, verse 9, what profit is there for the worker from that in which he toils? It's asking the same question that he asked in chapter 1 to kick us off. The futility of daily work under the sun. Once you get all your ducks in a row and then everything changes and you're given new ducks and you got to start over. That's what it feels like. It's, Sisyphus and pushing the rock up the hill. Verse 10, I've seen the task which God has given to the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. So his conclusion here is that no matter what the time or season calls for, God is ultimately in control. And I said the last time that the mistake we make so often is we search out the things of this world and expect them to provide us the meaning and fulfillment. But it's God that infuses those things with meaning. And we're going to see that at the end of the next chapter here to close us out. But here, Solomon says in verse 11, he has made everything appropriate in its time, literally beautiful in its time. I think the NIV translates it that way. And you may be tempted to ask, war is beautiful in its time? Yeah, well, you remember the picture from Revelation. Jesus waging war on his enemies, it will be beautiful because it will be right and it will be proper. Remember the martyrs underneath the throne, underneath the altar, saying, "How long, O Lord, before you avenge our blood on those who dwell upon the earth?" Right? It needs to be addressed at some point for justice to be true. And as such, it will be beautiful in its own way. But that's what God does. Man doesn't do that. That's where it's beautiful, right? And all of these things he's describing, though, to be fair, are describing what we have spent our time doing under the sun. And they are necessary at times. Sometimes it feels that it's necessary when you're living without God, but it's really not when you're living with God. Let's see what I'm getting at there. Anyway, and also, we saw last time, life seems so brief and this work so senseless that we wonder where the meaning is. And that's why he says here, he has set eternity in their heart so that they will, so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning to the end. One of the reasons I think why our labor on this earth seems futile is not that it's not enjoyable, but that God has made us for eternity. And so every job, no matter how much you love it, will get turned into drudgery at some point. But because our life seems so brief. Why does it seem brief? Because it is brief, right? It's brief because you're someone who was created to live forever. And we don't. So that's why it feels brief. We do. But
this is the prelude.
Right.
We have our eyes on the prelude, but we have eternity in our hearts. We're longing for a better
Yes.
place.
It's that Hebrews 11 thing. But remember, this is under the sun. This is what man feels when you live without God on the earth. And it feels brief to the humanistic man who, remember, someone once said, you have a soul. You do not have a soul, you are a soul. You have a body. And that's the point. It's the soulish part of you that's the same no matter how old or how young you are. It's that part that still feels the same as you did when you were 18. And that's why it's so frustrating, because the clay part of us doesn't. Yeah, I'm not sure.
You know, when my mother-in-law died, and that's when this whole thing about just having eternity in our hearts, and no matter how long you have on earth, it just seems like death is this interruption of the way it was supposed to be.
Was that the first parent that died for you? Yeah.
Since mine would go first.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and so, so ever since then, I've just really carried that truth. It's like, okay, the reason it seems wrong is because it is wrong.
Yeah, that's why Jesus wept at the grave of Lazarus, right?
I want to tell you that I was talking to somebody else who lost fellow people like I have, and I said, you know, it feels like, especially when people in the news of people who are the Lord, when the person you love, and then the person who dies, is like your heart is like, I know the other thing.
Yeah.
Your longing for heaven really increases.
Yes. Okay, but Solomon's saying here that God has hidden the big picture from us, right? He says, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning to the end. Have you ever looked at the back of a tapestry? I used to have one of dogs playing poker. Back when I was single. You know, time to hoard, time to throw away. Yeah. Anyway, but the back wasn't nice, and you couldn't really tell what the picture was from the back. You know, it's knots and tangles, and you can't really, you get a glimpse here and there. Well, that's a ace of spades, and that's a dog's tail. But it won't be evident in the end until he turns the tapestry around, is the picture. You know, that we see it from God's perspective. We will see the full picture. And that's really important to keep in mind if you're reading through Job, which I am, as I just shared. Verse 12. I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor, it is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will remain forever, yet there is nothing to add to it, and there is nothing to take away from it. For God has so worked that men should fear him. That which has been done already, and that which will be, has already been. For God seeks what has passed by. So this is kind of a temporary, it's like an interlude, where he jumps out of the narrative about living under the sun to giving a small conclusion before he jumps back into it. And he says in verse 12, I know that there's nothing better for them, these people living under the sun, than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. In James, as I think I quoted it last time, it was 3 weeks ago, so it's hard to remember, every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. When we have God, we have everything we need, right? It's axiomatic. And when we have more than that, it's his blessing to us, right? Notice that, like in the beginning of this chapter, this is looking at both ends of the topic. This is what we do on one end, and this is what God does on the other end. There's our labor in verse 13, God's gift, but there's then God's labor in verse 14. Solomon makes the case here, I think, in light of that, for humility, and this ties in with gratitude. You realize God is the only truly independent being in the universe, right? He's not dependent on anything or anyone else. The whole reason for his existence is in himself. And we are completely dependent on him for life and breath and everything. And in light of that, Solomon says in verse 14, I know that everything God does will remain forever. There's nothing to add to it. There's nothing to take away from it. For God has so worked that men should fear him. That's not a terror or be afraid kind of thing like we might think. It's humility based in light of who he is, right? And it does remind me of one of the arguments that one of Job's friends made, is that God doesn't need anything from us. And while that's true, that friend took it to the logical extension to mean that God also doesn't care if we follow him or not, but he just punishes evil because that's what he does. And that's not true. I mean, he does punish evil. That is what he does, but it's not true that he doesn't care. He cares deeply. Like I said before, he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, right? And he warns through his prophet, I think it was Jeremiah, why will you then die? Why not just, it's Isaiah or Jeremiah, I don't remember which one. Turn around. Don't make me do this, basically. And it's, verse 15, though, is a continuation of that thought from chapter 1, verse 9. That which has been is that which will be, and that which has been done is that which will be done, so there's nothing new under the sun. And there's kind of the bookend to that thought here in verse 15. The New Living Translation actually has a really good take on this. I like the way it says, verse 15, what is happening now has happened before. What will happen in the future has happened before. Because God makes the same things happen over and over again. I think it's a better way of putting it.
I don't think we have a good enough awareness of the way God works in time to really comprehend that.
Yeah, no. But we need to take it as true.
Do you think that's kind of referring to, when you're studying the Bible and you see, kind of that repetitive thing? It's it keeps cycling, or you see this is sort of like the foreshadowing of this, and over and over.
Types, yeah.
And so, do you think it's talking about something like that, or do you think it's just kind of like I've read about different generations? They tend to kind of have the same patterns, and you can look back and almost predict, what's going to happen. I forgot what that's called. It's like these cycles of life. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely that. I mean, there's seasons themselves are a testimony that God put cycles, but there's also cycles in mankind. If you look at the Judges, the book of Judges, how many cycles did the people go through? They would fall into sin, somebody would make them a slave, and God would, they would cry out to God, and God would raise up somebody to save them, and then they would just repeat over and over again. And I think it could be. Okay, by the way, remember, as we continue to the next section, specifically, the context is under the sun, without God. Verse 16. Furthermore, I have seen that under the sun, that in the place of justice there is wickedness, and in the place of righteousness there is wickedness. I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man, for a time for every matter and for every deed is there. That's an interesting comparison. He's comparing justice and righteousness. He's not really comparing them, but he's placing them side by side. If you're living righteously, then justice doesn't enter into it. Justice just is. Justice comes into play when righteousness is violated, right? Righteousness is living right. Justice is judging right when someone isn't living right.
I kind of think we're very much right there.
Oh, yeah. If you are unrighteous, there will be justice. When Solomon's looking for justice, he finds it corrupted in verse 16. In the place of justice, there is wickedness. And when he looks for righteousness, he finds the same thing. He says in verse 16, in the place of righteousness, there's wickedness. How horrible is it when justice is perverted? Because there's nothing to do when righteousness is perverted. I remember when the Gulf War started, they were talking, I guess they were trying to gin up the war, and they were saying how awful, actually it was in Afghanistan. It was in Afghanistan. They're trying to gin up a reason for going into Afghanistan, as if we needed a reason. But going into Afghanistan, they said, there was a news article about a guy who was poor, who was arrested by the government and taken into this ring where they were punishing people for crimes that they'd been convicted of. And this guy was brought in there. He wasn't convicted of anything, but he was brought in there and they cut his hand off. And he found out later that one of the leaders, the mullahs or whatever, his son was caught stealing. And his son is supposed to have his hand cut off under that law if you're caught stealing. But he paid a bribe, and they got this guy instead and cut off his hand instead of the mullah's son.
Oh, that sounds
It's
about
nice.
right.
That's what happens when you have righteousness and you find, wickedness, and then you look for justice and you find wickedness. That's exactly what Solomon's talking about here. But then he says, if you're wronged, you go to the police. If the police are corrupt, you go to the judge. If the judge is corrupt, you go to a politician. And they're all corrupt. So what then? Where do you go? That's kind of the picture he's drawing then. But Solomon says in verse 17, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man. And that's where you go. But when you're living life under the sun without God, you don't have that. And he concludes, verse 17, for a time for every matter and every deed is there. Back to the original idea from the beginning of the chapter. There's a time for everything. And there will be a time for God's justice, even if the people living under the sun without God don't know it. Verse 18, I said to myself concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts are the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for one man over beast. For man over beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place. All come from the dust, and all return to the dust. And who knows that the breath of man ascends upward, or the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth? For I have seen that nothing is better than that man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. For who will bring him to see what will occur after him? Now this is a great passage. When you're living your life under the sun without consideration for God, then this is very true. What is the difference between a man and a beast if there's no God? Because from that human perspective, both die, both return to the dust. You have a cemetery and you also have a pet cemetery. It's the same end for both.
People today will say that there is
Yeah.
no difference.
Exactly, and that's exactly what the world has concluded. Verse 19, the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. We're all just flesh and blood. We're all hairless apes, right? That's what the world tells us. Verse 20, they all go to the same place. All come from dust, all return to dust. Verse 21, who knows that the breath of man ascends upward and the breath of beast descends downward? He's saying, we know what people say about men versus beasts, but who can prove it? They say man is special, But it doesn't look any different from where I'm standing, is what they're saying. And the conclusion is, if we're all going to die one day, then get as much happiness as you can. This is the best the world can offer, right here. Don't worry, be happy. That's the conclusion. Yes. Verse 22, I have seen that there is nothing better than man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. That's the best you're going to get out of this spinning marble going through space. And then he stresses the finality of that perspective in verse 22. He says, for who will bring him to see what will occur after him? You're not going to know what happens after you die anyway. This is kind of the eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, right? That's the conclusion. That's the Epicurean thing, which Paul quoted, by the way, in 1 Corinthians 15. You remember back that far? Remember 1 Corinthians 15 is about the resurrection. And Paul said in verse 16, for if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. You're still in your sins. He concludes, now if Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. And he goes on to talk about all the suffering he saw or sees as a missionary, as he's going through the world, spreading the gospel. Hello. Okay, I got a text. And it was very loud. And why else he would, basically he says, why else would he submit to that kind of suffering if there is no resurrection? And he says in verse 30, why are we also in danger every hour? I affirm, brethren, by the boasting in you which I have in Christ Jesus our Lord, I die daily. If from human motives I fought with wild beasts in Ephesus, what does it profit me if the dead are not raised? And then he quotes, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. That's the Epicurean slogan there. And so that's basically what verse 22 is saying. For who will bring about to see what will occur after him? We're going to die. Party. Get all you can before you die. He continues, chapter 4. Then I looked again at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun, and behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, that they had no one to comfort them, and on the side of their oppressors was power, but they had no one to comfort them. So I congratulated the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still living, but better off than both of them is the one who has never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. So he's a bright little ray of sunshine, isn't he?
Well, it's actually, there's a lot of young people who are atheistic, a lot of them I have in my house.
Yeah, well, the last section dealing with how to live if life is all there is great. Eat, drink, be merry, and get all the joy you can out of this life. But what if your life stinks? What if you don't have the means to eat, drink, and be merry? Right? What if you're a slave? It's all fine and dandy to tell somebody that, but it's what if you're destitute, or worse, as he describes here, oppressed? Without God, to whom will the oppressed turn? This just popped into my head. I worked in an inner city ministry one time with this guy. He was black guy in Camden, grew up in the church, and he was watching at that time, this was in the 80s, watching late 80s, early 90s, the people in the inner city turn to Islam. And some of them weren't turning to Islam. Some of them were turning back to the African Spiritist thing. That was a movement back then. And his message to them was, those gods didn't save you from becoming slaves. You were brought over here. You know what made you free from slavery? When Christianity basically made you free from slavery. When the God's people, when the black slaves became Christians and got on their knees. Do you remember the old Negro spirituals and all of that? That when they turned to God, that's when their slavery ended, and that was his message to them. But that's anyhow. That's to whom will the oppressed turn? Is the idea here. Well, to the one who claims to be on their side, unfortunately, in this world. And often the ones who claim to be on their side have ulterior motives. And when your leaders are like that, you have no hope. That's what Solomon says in verse 2. He says he congratulated the dead. Congratulations. Verse 3, you're better off still as the one who has never existed, the one who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. That was Job's conclusion too, by the way, when he was hit with all of his travails. Oh, that I were never born, or that I died, in birth. The irony of this position is that without God, the perception is that death would be a relief. But it's quite the opposite, right? For those of us with God, death is a relief, but not for those who are without him. And yet, it looks that way to them, which is sad. Knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade men, right? Verse 4, I have seen that every labor and every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between man and his neighbor. This too is vanity and striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. One hand full of rest is better than 2 fists full of labor and striving after wind. So he continues on the injustice in the world by moving from oppression, where injustice is one-sided, to rivalry, where the injustice is two-sided. Both are wrong. But he concludes with, he includes, senseless competition based on envy. In verse 4, every labor and every skill which is done as a result of rivalry. This too is vanity. If you thought keeping up with the Joneses was new, no. There's a philosophical concept known as the ontic referent. It's the ultimate point of reference in life, in the universe, for everything. And this whole book is really about having a proper point of reference. Living under the sun without God is to choose to live without any meaningful point of reference. You ever been sitting at a red light and you're kind of, checking your phone or something, and all of a sudden the car next to you starts to move and you hit the brake harder because you think that maybe you've let off the brake and you're the one moving? You ever have that experience? Well, what happens when you don't know if you hit the brake and everything's still moving, and you look up to find a lamp post or something that is not moving, and the lamp post is moving? What do you do then? That's the fate of people in the world under the sun without God. There's no point of reference. You ask an atheist what is the point of being good if you're an atheist? They will give you happy-go-lucky, they'll try to, because it's better for us as a species. Maybe. It's not better for you as an individual, right? Take all you can. There's no point of reference without God. And so they need an ontic referent. Verse 4, he's talking about when that point of reference becomes your neighbor. By the way, you never completely get rid of a point of reference. You just replace God with something else. And so verse 4, he's saying you've replaced it with your neighbor. That's your point of reference. And so you're striving against them, to do better than them, to have more than them. But he continues with another point of reference that you can replace God with in verse 5, and that's you. And he's referring to laziness. When you become the point of reference, then it's all about you and your comfort and your ease and your rest. Also, though, he gives the complement to that. The opposite can be a problem as well. One hand full of rest, verse 6, is better than 2 fists full of labor and striving after wind. He's contrasting a lazy man to the man who never stops and never enjoys anything he's accumulated. When you put those together, he's talking about, on the one hand, somebody for whom every day is a Sabbath rest, and the other person for whom no day is a Sabbath rest. By the way, the proper ratio is 6 to 1. Verse 7. Yes. Verse 7. Then I looked again at vanity under the sun. There was a certain man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother, yet there was no end to all his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked, and for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? This too is vanity, and it is a grievous task. This is easy to miss. He says the man who works and works and works and just pours himself into his work and doesn't have a family, and that's a waste of time. He says, verse 8, his eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked, and for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? He's so busy doing, earning, and achieving that he never stops to ask why. I'm saying he's too busy, but the truth of the matter is today, if you look at the statistics, it's young women who are discovering this more than the young men, sadly. That we have a generation now, we're a couple generations into the feminist ideal, right? That, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle kind of thing. I don't need that. I just need a career. I'm going to do whatever. And I'm not saying women shouldn't have careers. My mom had a career. It was great. But a lot of these statistics and surveys and stuff are showing us that a lot of these women are now waking up in their late 30s, early 40s, and beyond to realize they're completely unhappy, right? Well, at least they have their cats. But that was a joke, people. Come on.
We were giving it over to
Okay. Part of the result of that kind of a life is you've cut yourself off from relationships. And ironically, some of the most meaningful and satisfying relationships you can have, which is family and children and a spouse, right? In seeking these other things, they've gone past the age where they can now have those other things. And so, there you go. And it's in this context, missing out of what relationships can bring. He says in verse 9, 2 are better than one because they have good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift the other up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. The cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. So there's more than just companionship in relationships. There's help and safety. And so, but you think about how sin tears apart relationships. What did the prodigal son do when he got his inheritance? He went to a far country to get away from those relationships that would have called him to account for the way he was living. He got far away from his father and anybody who knew his father, who would tell his father about what he was doing. But what does repentance do? Restored him to his father. Right? That's the picture. It's so sin, by the way, loneliness is the outcome of sin. Loneliness is not sin. Loneliness is the result of sin. Verse 13, a poor yet wise lad is better than an old fool and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction. For he has come out of prison to become king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. I have seen all the living under the sun throng to the side of the second lad who replaces him. There is no end to all the people, to all who are before him, to even the ones who will come later will not be happy with him. For this too is vanity and striving after wind. So this is a little strange. It's talking about a revolution, right? And it makes sense when you look at it in this context. We started off with oppression. He moved to rivalry, and then he moved to the Lone Ranger, and now we come to the opposite extreme of oppression. When people are unhappy with their lives, they can either look outward or look inward, right? And if they look outward, they can blame the people or institutions, the government, ultimately. And so if they blame government, they want to replace it. And that's probably what it's talking about here. And even if they replace him with their guy, Solomon says, verse 16, even the ones who will come later will not be happy with him. For this too is vanity and striving after wind. It's Republicans have control now. And now the Democrats have control. And now the Republicans have control. And yes. But even if it's not the uniparty, somebody's still not going to be happy that whoever is in, right? And this is, again, striving after wind under the sun without God.
Even with being besieged with enemies on all sides, they're struggling within. There's definitely left and right factors who are battling.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I know. I went over.
Yeah.
But this is the futility of life without God. Without that, but we have the ontic referent. We have the point of reference, and he infuses these things with meaning in our lives if we let him. All these things that Solomon says are vanity and striving after wind. they become for us gifts and blessings from God's hand. You know what's really ironic about this? All of these things that we can get in this life, the good things, they won't be as important to us as they are to the people in the world without God. They will be much more important to them. But here's the irony. We will enjoy them more because we know the giver of all good things. Because we get to see him through those things.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis. The people of the world, we confuse them with the thing itself. Okay. All right, I know I went over. Let me close in prayer. Lord, thank you for this reminder that the futility of life on this earth, how it would be futile, and it is futile for those who don't know you. And that we get the opportunity to have that point of reference that is you, that unmovable point by which we can judge all other things. And we thank you for that. Help us to remember that when things look hopeless, that we have an anchor. And thank you for that reminder. And help us to reflect on this as we see what unbelievers around us are really struggling with, that we can answer them in their times of need with this point of reference. And thank you for that reminder. Be with us as we go now. In Jesus' name, amen.
Guys,
Thank you all.
so I see one texted that she's not gonna